we have great people. Well, I don't have to get into that, but we have one of them standing right here. We have JD, obviously. The vice president is great. I think Marco's great. I think, I'm not sure if anybody would run against us. I think if they have...
And that was a clip from November 27th, 2025, a press gaggle on Air Force One in which a reporter asks President Donald J. Trump who, other than himself, would be a good Republican nominee in 2028. For those of you who are not watching the video and are just listening to this on your iPhone or your Android or something, Marco Rubio is in the background, and when Trump says, here's a guy over here who would be a good nominee, he sort of looks bashful and looks down and then starts to giggle a little bit, and it's just like all too much like the senior prom. So this is the Prince of Darkness edition of the Political Junkie podcast. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
Here we go, Neil, with another week, but you have gone from Florida to Los Angeles. How did the puppy like flying?
Oh, the puppy's great flying. We travel with him a lot, so he's a pro. He just goes in his bag, takes like a quarter of a Benadryl, and, wakes up 6 hours later. I wish I could do the same thing.
Well, we had a little bit of spring here in New England, and then it went away, so it's raw and gloomy and ugly again. But I want to say, Neil, I keep having these dreams about Rachel Maddow. Why do you think that is?
Well, Claire, I mean, what's going on there? Is there something you need to tell us?
Well, all right. So there are two things about Rachel Maddow that are really important. One is when I moved to Northampton, and I would say to people, I really miss New York. It's really a big deal for me to live in a place where there's a lot going on. It's the media center of the world. And invariably, what my friends in Northampton would say to me was, well, Rachel Maddow lives near here. And I would be like, yeah, but she's not really my friend. So here's what I think. Oh, the other thing is when I go to New York and I say I live in Northampton and people say, oh, have you seen Rachel Maddow? And so, well, yes, I did once on the train. From Northampton to Springfield.
So in neither place.
Neither place, no. But when you take the train from Northampton to Springfield, you can then change to another Amtrak that goes from Springfield to New York. And part of what was shocking to me about seeing her on the train is I thought, well, you're Rachel Maddow. You make millions of dollars a year. Don't you, take a helicopter or something like that? But being a good New Yorker, of course, we New Yorkers, you know this, Neil, because you yourself are a New Yorker, you don't bother celebrities when you run into them. You just pretend like this is an ordinary day. Right? Yep. So, but my dream about Rachel Maddow was that she really liked our podcast.
I mean, that feels like one of those dreams that probably is true.
I think it probably is true. And, maybe I'll just have to go and stalk her in the small town that she lives in outside Northampton and then just come up behind her and say, do you like our podcast? So, Neil, there's been a lot of news this week, and that's where we always start. Let's begin with the No Kings Part 3 last weekend. I think the biggest event was probably in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They had a really robust turnout there. The crowd was graced by special appearances from Jane Fonda and Joan Baez, including, did you see the great picture of them together?
I did, yeah.
Oh, wasn't that darling?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're both so beautiful, but just watching them leaning up against each other and realizing how many of these struggles they've been through.
Yeah.
So Bruce Springsteen was also there and sang his anthem to the city, which we're linking to listeners. Neil, how many people took part nationwide?
The estimate organizers are claiming it was around 8 million people took part across the nation in these protests. Lots and lots of young people are coming out in the most recent one. And I think, the motivation there is opposition to the war against Iran. That's something that a lot of people have noted, that was sort of a new dimension of these protests in the recent one. In New York, in Manhattan, the procession was for more than a mile. Washington D.C., the parade route went right by Stephen Miller's house. And of course, what would you do when you would march by his house? You would, yell out for his removal. Honestly, I feel a little bit sorry for him because as someone who lived in the West Village, like right by the gay pride parade, I have a certain feeling about parades and protests and when they're in your front yard. But I don't know. Actually, Stephen Miller, he deserves it.
He certainly does deserve it. And the National Republican Campaign Committee, of course, came out with their usual tactful responses about free assembly. They derided the events as hate America rallies. White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson referred to them as Trump derangement therapy sessions created by leftist funding networks. And there was something circulating on X about what those funding networks were. But it's not altogether clear to me that No Kings is really funded. I mean, there was no sourcing for that list. I think they're mostly locally organized, aren't they, Neil?
Yeah, I think so too. This is like this obsession with the right and deriding any sort of public movement, any public protest as, funded by left-wing networks. Sometimes this is more coded than that. But it's a wild sort of obsession they have that like all of this is being financed by, certain folks. Yep. And yet, of course, we know the sort of history that such allegations track in. The other thing I saw, I can't remember who it was. It was one of those conservative Hollywood actors, maybe it was Kevin Sorbo, had posted something in response to a woman who had posted something like, if there are so many supporters of Trump, why aren't there any counter protest to the No Kings protest? And Kevin Sorbo, or again, some other Hollywood conservative, posted something like, well, that's because we all have jobs. And I'm like, what Republicans work on a Saturday? I mean,
right.
Okay.
Right. And what would the counter protest be? Kings? Let's have kings?
Yeah.
I mean, come
coronation ceremony. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I think what you were saying about lots of young people being out is really important. I remember the first two No Kings protests were also really derided by the right, at least on Twitter, as saying, it's just a bunch of old women that are out there.
Yeah.
It's only old people that care about this. I think Trump is really treading on very thin ice around the young. And of course, it was a lot of young people that really powered his reelection because, of course, every young man in America who's over 18 is registered for the draft. And that happened in the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration reinstituted the draft, made it necessary to do that to get any kind of federal funding for your education. So, if you are a draft resistor, and there's no particular war you're resisting, it seems sort of fruitless. I don't think anybody thought Trump would bomb Iran. So it seems reasonable that young people are sort of waking up and saying, hey, he could actually draft us, right?
Yeah, young people are really paying attention to this, which is good, and really concerned, which they should be. You have Lindsey Graham basically telling South Carolina voters that they should prepare their sons for war. So this is becoming more and more like normalized within Republican discourse. Now they're not using the draft word, obviously, but like they're stepping around it, tiptoeing around it. Did you see this video the other day with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, where he was doing a sit-down interview, I think with NBC, and all of a sudden he gets pulled out for an emergency meeting with Trump, and he comes back, and he looks so absolutely flustered, and the reporter asks him sort of, oh, what's going on? Everything good? And he launches into the most programmed speech about how, he serves the most wonderful president who has the most wonderful vision for what's happening in Iran. And, he has two grown sons, and his sons are joining the military, and they will be more than happy to fight for this president overseas, and it's like, whoa, no, why did you go there? Like it was quite a tell. So folks should look for that video because it's quite chilling. But yeah, young people are concerned. They're paying attention. I don't think anyone wants to go fight this war. And the threat of it seems more and more looming for young folks as it seems like the administration is just continuing to escalate.
Yeah, well, the day we see Melania driving Barron down to the recruiting station, I'll believe that actually Republicans care enough about America to sacrifice their children to it, or at least American politicians. Okay, so in slightly lighter but sadder fare, here's something we didn't see coming, Neil. Kristi Noem's husband, Brian, was outed by the Daily Mail on Tuesday as a visitor to a cross-dressing fetish website devoted to something I've never heard of, bimbofication. Okay, did you read enough about this to figure out what bimbofication is and why there's a website devoted to it?
Well, I did my homework for this conversation, but this is a word I didn't know, 2 or 3 days ago, and I'm not really grateful to have learned it. But are we going to explain it? It's
well,
basic.
I guess so. I mean, here's my impression of it. Okay,
Yeah.
Is that it's like being a trad wife, except you are a fetish crossdresser, right?
Well, I don't think you have to cross-dress. I think women can participate in bimbofication, but the idea is that, like, it is the most extreme feminization of yourself that's sexualized. So, like, oversized breasts, like overdone makeup, like sort of baby Barbie looks, and that then all of this is like sort of a persona you take on for. Sort of, I don't know if sexual humiliation is right, but like a sort of like over sexualized persona in this encounter. So it's actually being distinguished from cross-dressing because women participate in it too. And apparently it's a whole genre.
Okay. All right.
One that doesn't clearly appeal to you or me, but
no. Well,
to each their own.
I thought I knew everything, but I don't. So you can read the allegations that the Daily Mail made in the New York Post. We're going to offer a link to that. A spokesperson for Kristi Noem says that the family was blindsided by this and they asked for privacy and prayers at this time. No shit. President Donald Trump was actually kind of nice about it and said, oh, that's too bad for the family. I feel really bad for Brian Noem. He's not speaking to the press for obvious reasons. I doubt seriously that Kristi was blindsided by this. I really don't understand how you could be married to someone for decades and not know that they have sexual fetishes. But part of what struck me about the story in the New York Times is they went and interviewed people in the Noem's hometown of Castlewood, South Dakota, where dear Brian sells insurance. And there's like a picture of his small town insurance firm. I mean, it's enough to make you cry. And the neighbors have been really decent about it. As somebody who has studied gay conservatives, and we're not saying Brian is gay because it's obviously more complicated than that, how do you take this, Neil? How do you take the community sort of trying to wrap themselves around him a little bit?
Well, I think a couple of things. Like one of the responses was that folks didn't believe it, right? And so there's a deniability that's even more accessible in the days of AI, right? Of course, Kristi Noem herself has said basically, in asking for privacy during the time, she hasn't disputed this. So, I mean, I think it's like clear that this is something that actually happened. I think that I don't know that any of these folks are thinking in depth about Brian and his sexuality, but I think there's a bit of a we know him, he's a good man, he goes to church with us, he's always lived here, that sort of allows a certain deniability around this or just even some compartmentalization about it that I think is at work. I think there's a sort of like Midwestern, we're going to take care of our own and protect him. And honestly, I think that's a very nice, I mean, this is a town of 700 people. I like looked it up on the map and spent time reading about it on Wikipedia, which didn't take very long time because, there's 700 people there. But, this is not like New York City where he gets to like blend in and nobody cares. I feel bad for him too, because he clearly doesn't want the spotlight here. I mean, they don't have much of a marriage from what we can tell. She may be doing her own thing with someone else. He's selling insurance in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota. And like now he has to go to like First Methodist on Sunday for Easter service. And when this is the news that is broken this week, you kind of have to feel bad for the guy. I don't know how it gets resolved, but like, does this allow her to like divorce him and look like the good person when everything that's been reported so far has been that she's carrying on an affair? I mean, this might be sort of her perfect exit from that situation.
That's a good point. I never thought of that, Neil. I did think, oh, no wonder she's having an affair with Corey Lewandowski, although why you would choose Corey Lewandowski is completely beyond me because he's a horrible human being. On the other hand, she's kind of a horrible human being. And I think of the three of them, I would go to church with Brian.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's like we could say so much more about this, and you just think like, shouldn't people be entitled to their privacy? Like, this guy is not a public figure; he's married to one, and I think as several accounts have pointed out, she's put herself even more in the spotlight because of her own actions in her position. Like, there's no reason for her to be top headline every day, but she has created that scenario, and so in that context, a story like this, it's not surprising that it breaks. But of course, he's the one that really seems to be obviously the victim here of just a story that I don't think he should have to have exposed.
It does make me wonder why people don't understand the internet a little better than they do. I mean, I think obviously if you live in a small town in South Dakota, I mean, I remember decades ago, people who were transgender would drive for hundreds and hundreds of miles to meetups in motels in California and so on to dress up and hang out with each other and share tips and stuff like that. And that was very pre-internet. I think the fact that everything that has gone on in terms of people being exposed on the internet, people's privacy being ripped away, people being hacked and so on, there is a certain level in which I want to say, Brian, what were you thinking? Wasn't there another way to be you than putting yourself out there? But maybe it will be freeing for him in some way to no longer be confined by his horrible wife's political life. Okay, so let's move on to the next news item. Judge Gerald J. Papert of Philadelphia's Federal District Court has given the University of Pennsylvania 30 days to comply with the Trump administration's demand for a list of Jewish faculty, staff, and students. Penn is appealing the ruling, arguing that the university has an obligation to the privacy rights of its employees and that it does not maintain such lists. Neil, what could go wrong here? Yeah,
what could go wrong? I mean, this is so chilling. And I'm just really struck by just like, how is this supposed to even happen? Right? I mean, like, universities do not track their students along, religious categorization. So how would they even go about doing this? What sort of, I mean, I guess there's ways like administratively you could force everyone to like fill out an online survey, but like, this seems really overbearing in just an administrative realm, let alone, the deeper implications of what it means for a list of Jewish persons to be compiled and for that list to be handed over to the government.
Yeah, there are friends of ours that have said, well, this was really clumsy, they did it wrong, but actually what the government really wants is for Penn to compensate people that were harmed after the October 7th killings, everything that followed from that. I guess part of what I want to say to everyone is, can we look at the history? Because Ivy League schools like Penn and a great many other schools did in fact maintain lists of Jewish students. They knew who the Jewish students were because they only accepted a certain quota of them. And Penn in particular has a very ugly history. Somebody I interviewed for my project on Susan Brown Miller told me that when she showed up at Penn, they gave her the sort of, campus Facebook thing. And next to each name was P for Protestant, C for Catholic, or H for Hebrew.
Wow.
And she was shocked by this because she'd grown up in Brooklyn, a completely Jewish neighborhood. She'd never really encountered anti-Semitism before. And when she asked about it, a dean explained to her that it was so fraternities and sororities could avoid the embarrassment of rushing people who ultimately they could not ask to join because they were the wrong religion. Yeah. Yeah. So there's that ugly, but the other ugly, to me at least, and I'm curious what you think about this, is that the Trump administration, even if it did do this in a way that was helpful, and I don't believe it because they're so transactional, what if that list leaks out? I mean, we're talking about an administration that is riddled with white supremacists and anti-Semites. I wouldn't want my kid to go on such a list, would you?
No, not at all. And I think like the possibility of it being leaked or getting into the wrong hands is high with this administration that has such a sloppiness for everything it does. I mean, this is, in the first administration, there were national security documents or, highly classified documents that ended up in a bathroom in Mar-a-Lago. So there's a sloppiness, and whether that's by just design or because it's just a lot of incompetence happening there, I don't know. But no, absolutely not would you want your child to be on such a list, nor should any person be subjected to such a thing. If they really, and I think if you read Judge Pappert's comments around this, he's sort of taking, it's not a full-throated endorsement of what the Trump administration is doing as much as it's they do sort of want to, this is about, their sort of way of dealing with anti-Semitism on this campus. And so, this is about making sure the injured are notified and compensated. But it does seem like there's other ways to do that, right? Couldn't people come forward if they wanted to be compensated, to be included in such a thing? The conscription on this feels really problematic, in addition to actually making a list. I just don't know how you do this, right? If you have any awareness of history, how do you do something like this?
Well, and they're gonna be some people who have, say, a Jewish father but not a Jewish mother.
Right.
So according to Jewish law, they're not really Jewish. There are people who were allies of Jewish people on campus who may, in fact, I know people who were harmed by anti-Semitism who were not themselves Jewish, who were on the front lines because they were defending their Jewish friends and colleagues. So that seems weird to me. The other thing that seems weird to me, frankly, is that I don't think universities or the federal government have ever done a good job of protecting anybody. And I say this as a woman and a feminist, who has followed sexual harassment and sexual assault very, very closely on college campuses. I did a lot of work on it when I was at Wesleyan. And institutions have never actually dealt with the kinds of structural reforms or the kinds of education they would have to do to prevent anti-Semitism. And I really don't see how paying off people who were harmed by it accomplishes anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not really about accomplishing things other than punishing Penn, right? Punishing an institution. Right. That's sort of the connective thread of a lot of, the actions that this administration takes is it's a punitive one.
Yeah. I did learn in the course of a conversation about this with a bunch of other people that Columbia has indeed established such a commission in which they are saying to people, if you believe you were harmed, please come forward and we will compensate you financially. And apparently people are getting up to $300,000. It's a $21 million fund.
Holy cow.
I know. And you went to Columbia in graduate school, so you know something about how good they are at this kind of stuff.
I definitely have my set of grievances with Columbia, but I don't think that they apply to this case. But maybe they'll create a different fund for those of us who went to grad school there.
Right, exactly. All right, so our final news item is a Colorado law banning gay conversion therapy, which has been struck down by the Supreme Court, or rather it's been sent back, I think, with all justices but Ketanji Brown Jackson voting in the affirmative. Can you tell us a little something about that case, Neil?
Well, this is a case where a Christian counselor in Colorado has brought the suit, claiming that the people who come to her are folks who are seeking to make their lives aligned with their religious beliefs. And these are folks who, in her words, are struggling with their sexual orientation or their gender identity. The court, and I mean, it's really, we should talk a little bit more about this. It was an 8-1 ruling, right? So This is not like some partisan divided decision. You have everyone but Justice Jackson aligning with this, and they're sort of, and you can read Sotomayor and Elena Kagan's thoughts about this, and they saw this as that the law was basically an affront to neutrality, because it was saying that certain speech couldn't be provided in a counseling session, whereas other speech in the affirmative, like if you came and you're like, I think I might be gay, and the therapist is allowed to say, you probably are, and here's what you can do about it, that wasn't banned by this. And so that was a state intervention or a sort of state bias around free speech. Justice Jackson had a very different framing of this, which was that she, her decision, her opposition said, well, a state should be allowed to regulate medical practice. But this counselor is not a doctor. This is not related to psychiatry or medical practice. So I actually thought it was a much more complicated case when I read about it and saw the sort of 8-1 decision around it than when the headlines were hitting me and I was like, oh gosh, what is this,
Yeah. So it's interesting. You raise a lot of really good points. One of the aspects of Kaylee Childs, the therapist, is that in fact she has never had a patient who came to her for conversion therapy.
Yes.
So it's another one of these conservative cases where someone is going to court and saying, I'm afraid that if this happens, I will lose my license and I will be sanctioned. So that's interesting, and
that's
just
important
sort of follow
too, right?
this.
Because that's important too, because on those grounds, the case really shouldn't go forward, right? You haven't actually been injured yet, which is a condition for moving a case like this forward. So I remember when that sort of went forward, that a lot of sort of legal experts were saying that was problematic in itself.
Right.
Correct, Claire?
Right. That is absolutely correct, and it's like a number of other cases, and I'm sort of searching my brain to come up with another one, but there have been a number of these cases in which somebody says, I am afraid that harm will befall me, therefore I can't do what I need to do, blah, blah, blah. So there's that. Another thing that I guess is distressing is the vast amount of conversion therapy is parents trying to change their children. Now, one of the things the court said is that this wasn't about the more abusive forms of conversion therapy that we've all heard about and read about, but rather simply conversation. But it doesn't really stop at conversation, and these therapeutic boarding schools are a really big industry, and children are abused there. The other thing about conversion therapy is it doesn't really work, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yes, to all that. And also, again, back to sort of Kaylee Childs and the plaintiff here, it's sort of it was this obviously perfectly designed, case that
Right.
this conservative legal group brought forward for these very reasons, I think, to sort of present a narrow case, but that I think has real expansive consequences. Childs has pointed out, in some ways it's a bizarre defense of yourself that you've never actually had this sort of scenario before. You're just worried about the future. But apparently also has said, I'm not claiming to cure anyone, and that's not what my practice is. I just, for the Christian adult who's struggling with their sexuality and their religious faith, I'm someone who wants to talk about it from a biblical perspective, quote unquote, right? So that's a very sort of narrow articulation of an issue that is much bigger than what's happening in her particular practice. And I think the ramifications of this are going to be immense, right? I mean, this strikes down what is it, 20 laws in different states that ban this practice?
27.
27.
Yeah, 27. I mean, it's huge. It does make me wonder whether going through legislatures has been the right approach, because and this, I don't know the law, but one of the things that struck me as a little off with Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent is, yes, states do have the right to regulate medical treatment, but they usually do it through state medical boards, not through the legislature.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, particularly given how many legislatures have passed a lot of other damaging laws that withdraw gender care from the young and sometimes from adults as well. Legislatures have been used to politicize a great many issues about gender and sexuality that perhaps belong more properly in state medical boards that are actually considering the evidence around these things.
Yeah.
Although Childs might have actually sued the state medical board too. It also, and I'll close the conversation.
Is she overseen by the state medical board? I mean, again, she's not.
I think so. I think she's licensed by them.
Okay.
Even psychologists are licensed by the state. And she was basically saying, if anybody comes in and says the word gay or lesbian, I have to shut them down, which sounded a little nuts to me. But it also made me think about it, and this has come up in this podcast from time to time, of the fair number of conservatives who struggle with their sexuality but go ahead and marry somebody of the opposite sex anyway, have children anyway. And of course, this is not new in history, but we are seeing a fair number. I mean, the Benny Johnson story, for example. I mean, I truly believe that Benny Johnson both wants to be married to a woman and have a family, and that he's gay or bisexual. And I guess bisexual is the word to use. So it does make me think that there's something really interesting going on among Christian therapists and in Christian families about how you can commit to a certain kind of life even though you're in struggle. And that perhaps therapy teaches you to do that.
Yeah, and I've written actually a lot about this in the Mormon context because there's a fascinating history there when it comes to therapeutics. There's actually some LDS psychologist who worked closely with evangelical psychologists sort of in the 80s and the 90s to develop the very sort of therapeutic practice you're talking about, that one of the things that it recommended was that even that people who were gay, that they would enter into marriage. And sometimes that was presented as, being curative, but especially in more recent years, it wasn't presented as a cure as much as a sort of strategy and a way to live one's life. And that's an important, transformation that happens within that history. But there's a sort of enormous world of this, and also some really good scholarship around it too that people can check out if they're interested.
I think it's so interesting. And, I think one of the things that's interesting about being queer in the 21st century is we know so much more about what constitutes human sexuality and what constitutes desire and the kinds of choices people feel are available to them. So yeah, and it has a lot to do with politics.
Well, wait, Claire, before
Yeah.
we move on, I'm a bit surprised. Do you not know the latest news, the breaking news of this afternoon?
No.
Pam Bondi has been fired.
Whoa! I saw in the New York Times that they were talking about firing her and
It's
putting Lee Zeldin
literally within
in.
the last hour it's been announced. So I didn't
Holy
see it on
moly.
our agenda, and I thought, could Claire have possibly missed this? But yes, Pam Bondi is
yes.
out. Bye Bondi.
Wow. Well, because I was messing around with my computer and trying to figure out why the sound didn't work. Neil, oh my goodness. Well, talk a little more about that. What is the news that you have heard other than her being fired? And we do think Lee Zeldin is the next candidate.
Yeah, I think Zeldin
is.
is probably right. Someone's already been put in as the acting director.
Wow.
Trump announced it, as he does on social media, and it was like, in his way of like, it's not a firing, it's she's going on to a great opportunity in the private sector, which will be announced.
I'm sure.
Which will be announced later. So like, I guess they're scrambling behind the scenes to find her a job at like
Wow.
Goldman Sachs or something, and they can pretend like, or Fox News, and they can pretend
Right.
like this is all part of that. But yeah, I mean, I think, and I literally about 15 minutes after I saw the news of Bondi's firing, I got one of those PR emails from a Vegas odds maker
Right.
organization, where now all the Vegas bettors are putting the money on Pete Hegseth as the next one to be ousted. So it feels like there might be something happening in this administration, and Trump is going to start cutting people left and right. But the Bondi stuff is about the Epstein files, and Trump's feeling like she really botched things up, which she did, but
Which she did. But also, what I was reading this morning is that he's also really angry at her because all of these legal cases that he ordered her to
Yes.
file against the better judgment of all of her underlings have, of
Yes.
course, failed.
Yeah.
And that they lose in court all the time. It couldn't happen to a nicer person. I feel not a
Completely.
shred of sympathy for Pam
not one
Bondi.
bit. I mean, this
Yeah.
woman has been so loyal to this man, to her, in complete embarrassment and abasement. But couldn't happen to a better person. I think I mentioned this wonderful New Yorker profile of her that when we talked about her in a recent episode. So folks should read that piece, because it really gets into just her sort of fascinating history. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, her parents were professors and like registered Democrats, and she grew up in a very different context than but she saw this pathway to power via MAGA, and has accommodated herself better than anyone else, I think, to that sort of MAGA loyalty to Trump. And what did it serve her? Like anyone else, nothing.
Right.
Nothing. There's no reciprocity for that loyalty that folks give to Trump. So best of luck to her. Lee Zeldin will be an interesting person in this figure. Also, other people are pointing out in Trump's social media posting, he referred to Bondi as my attorney general. And that one little word, I mean, on one hand, it just, this is not a smart guy, doesn't really understand things, but also like how revealing, right? My attorney general.
Yeah. So I just want to pursue this a little bit more, because what strikes me is what lemmings these people are.
Yeah.
I mean, Kristi Noem was governor of South Dakota. She probably could have easily run for Senate if she cooled her jets a little
Absolutely.
bit. She was never going to be president. Pam Bondi was talked about as governor of Florida. I mean, these are people who had paths to power independent of Trump. They had people around them who were encouraging them, and instead they went to work for Donald Trump and were ruined like everybody else. Can you think of one person, one politician, who has really profited from their association with Donald Trump?
Well, this might cue up our coming conversation, because
Okay.
I think for me, Marco Rubio is maybe an open question around that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's segue to Marco Rubio and to our news focus for this week, which is the Princes of Darkness, Vice President J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. And let's start that conversation with an annual poll of young conservatives at CPAC last month. in which Vice President J.D. Vance won with 53%, but that was down from 61% last year. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was in single digits last year, rose to 35%. Other candidates, possible candidates for 2028, were in the very low single digits, including reruns like Ron DeSantis, Ted Cruz, and Tulsi Gabbard, who the last time around ran as a Democrat. Such a jerk. Rubio also won a little contest they were doing, and this is done at CPAC. They have jars, and you put a pinto bean in the jar throughout the conference, so they have all these jars. Rubio also won favorite cabinet member, while Ken Paxton outscored John Cornyn in the Texas Senate primary by a whopping 46 points. So give our listeners a little bit of context for the CPAC straw poll, Neil.
Well, I think the biggest thing to know is like it's not predictive at all. It's probably, and in some ways it might be a curse to win the CPAC poll. I mean, Ron Paul won it 2010, 2011, Mitt Romney, he won it repeatedly. So I guess like obviously he did become the nominee at one point. Ted Cruz won it in 2016. I mean, basically except for Trump in 2024, the straw poll has never accurately predicted who would be president in an election year, let alone who would even be like the Republican nominee. So, but it's historically been seen as a very important sort of way to establish one's conservative credentials to the base, and that from there you build things. But again, like winners don't become winners overall here. I do think a lot of folks use it as an important way to sort of draw attention to themselves and build from there. I mean, Trump, we'll talk about this. Trump, really the sort of opening moment of him as a politician was when he spoke to CPAC in 2011. And I have a lot more to say about that, but we can maybe get to that in a bit.
Well, and also Ronald Reagan. I mean, when the ACU had its first CPAC in 1974, Ronald Reagan came, and that was sort of the beginning of his presidential bid after being governor. But, I just want to say something about Mitt Romney, who has probably won the straw poll more than anyone else. I think it's because he's a handsome daddy. I think that is the bottom line. And I think the straw poll does reveal whether a large group of young people know you at all. And I think this whole question of name recognition is a very big deal.
Absolutely. And I think that's where I raised that question about Rubio, because I think Rubio, you said Rubio, last year was in single digits. This year he's at 35. I think the bounce there is just name recognition and visibility via, his connection with Trump. Now, does it serve him well with the general population? Probably not at all. But it seems like he got a big bounce, at least with these folks, because of that.
Yeah. So let's talk about CPAC a little bit more, just to give a sense of these two guys coming out of it. It's basically a festival for young people of conservatism. It allows you to take the temperature of what conservatism means at any particular moment, and you can really see a variety of movements sort of being birthed from CPAC. We mentioned the founding in 1974 in a Manhattan hotel. That launched the New Right. It launched Ronald Reagan toward the presidency. He didn't get the nomination in 76, but it was a huge floor fight that he barely lost.
Yep.
And, CPAC has become more and more important as it has become more media driven. So tell us a little bit about that, Neil.
Well, I think that it's just sort of become a place where folks can become famous within this influential world of the conservative base. And I think that's not just politicians, that's also media figures and now, social media influencers, all of them stand to gain prominence and visibility by making a splash at CPAC, and it's done in different ways. You think of Laura Ingraham and others who've used these sort of speech moments or even just being there to like give visibility to themselves. And I think that like there's a long history around that. I mean, I do think you are really right to remind us the sort of origins of that as a way of helping us think about like what it looks like today, because CPAC, I think, was one of the most important organizations, connected to obviously its founding organization, the American Conservative Union, for mobilizing what we know as the new right and the sort of transformation of conservatism in the 70s and 80s that's like tied to the rise of Reagan. In more recent decades, it had more of a libertarian leaning for a while, but that created all sorts of tensions within the organization with, older folks who are the sort of social conservative parts of the party that felt like they were the base of CPAC. So it's been an organization that has both sort of changed with the Republican Party and has changed the Republican Party over time. And I think it's a place where, like, again, even if the straw poll isn't predictive of like who the nominee is going to be or who the president will be, I think the experience of CPAC and the sort of opportunity of CPAC as an event for folks to make a name for themselves has been hugely influential in the history of the modern conservative movement.
Yeah, I agree. It's also a huge networking opportunity for the young. The year that I went, I was really impressed by the large number of college students in business attire. And they're all running around to workshops on how to do your resume, workshops on how to get into journalism, workshops on how to get into politics, and so on. And so there's a real sort of draw for young campus activists because they know they can go to CPAC and they can make a lot of connections. I also want to say that the American Conservative Union, I believe, was founded by William F. Buckley. And the point of the whole thing was to bring all the different tendencies of conservatism together in one place and to have the conservative movement march forward together. And that, of course, was the dream of the New Right. Since 2014, when former Bush advisor Matt Schlapp was elected head of the American Conservative Union, it's really been the opposite. And CPAC has been the place where the more radical tendencies have clustered, where Fox News clustered, where Steve Bannon clustered, although Steve Bannon was not allowed to be there for years until Trump won the election. And then Matt Schlapp was like, oh, yeah, we have to invite Steve Bannon to come give a speech. I would also say that Schlapp and his wife Mercedes are very canny entrepreneurs. They've turned CPAC into this kind of national and international franchise. There are satellite conferences all over the place. I think it must be a huge moneymaker. And it's also famous for the partying, isn't it, Neil? Tell us a little about that.
Yes, it's famous for the partying. I mean, this is it's their like Olympics, it's their Lollapalooza, it's everything, right? I mean, this is such an event for them. And I think, one of the things that happens sort of every time CPAC, this also happens when like the Republican National Convention occurs, but there's all these stories that come out that like Grindr, which is this, app for gay men to find each other to spend time together, that Grindr crashes every time like CPAC is in town. Now, I don't know about you, but I sort of never fully trust these stories. I don't think the sourcing around them it really holds up, but it's now become this recurring like news story whenever a major, and this also happened at the Charlie Kirk funeral. Like people were claiming that Grindr had crashed out in Phoenix or wherever that was taking place.
Well, I tried to source it, and what I thought was interesting is I couldn't find a story in The Advocate about it. And if it should be any place, it should be on The Advocate. What I did find was a lot of Reddit threads about it. But the relationship of MAGA to gay Republican groups has also been very vexed. And since you're our expert, Neil, I'm going to toss the ball back to you. What has been the back and forth around gay Republicans at this MAGA-fied event? Well,
before we even get there, I want to go back to the history, to the origin of this, because you mentioned William F. Buckley. You're right. Yeah. He did found the American Conservative Union. He did it in 1964, and he did it with two other men. This is chapter 2 of my recent book, if you're interested. Actually, one
Buy
of my
Neil's book. Buy
favorite
Neil's
chapters
book.
to write. I begin the chapter with this scene, and I loved writing this. So in 1964, William F. Buckley. It's in October 1964. The election's about to happen. Everyone knows Goldwater is about to lose in a landslide. William F. Buckley goes to breakfast in New York City with 2 other men. Those 2 other men are Bob Bauman and Marvin Liebman. And at this meeting, they're basically freaking out because they know Buckley's about to, or excuse me, they know Goldwater's about to lose. And so they're like, what do we do? Like, how do we plan for the future? And at this breakfast meeting, they come up with the idea for the American Conservative Union. These 3 men had also been part of the founders of Young Americans for Freedom 4 years before. So they're building the conservative institutions of the 1960s that basically give us the modern conservative movement and that lead to Reagan. Why have I mentioned these other 2 men with William F. Buckley? Well, because they're closeted gay men. And so the sort of queer history of CPAC is there from the beginning, although for most of this history, it's closeted. There's so many gay men who are involved in Young Americans for Freedom and American Conservative Union that, I write about in the book. And so all of that, I think, is just precursor to this question about gay Republicans who become much more, once they're sort of out and about, particularly through the organization of log cabin Republicans in the 80s and 90s, they're trying to get into CPAC for a really, really long time, and they're never able to because social conservatives control this organization. But finally, in 2010, and this is really when you have the influence of the Tea Party and the sort of changing sort of politics of the Republican Party in those years, and like the early Obama years, when that's like, oh, there's a bit of a libertarian spirit coming about. In 2010, this organization called Go Proud, which is a breakaway group from Log Cabin Republicans. Log Cabin Republicans is the oldest and largest gay Republican organization. Go Proud breaks away from Log Cabin Republicans, and in 2010 they're invited by CPAC to co-sponsor that year's event. And they do it because they think we are an organization that's about young people and mobilizing young people, and like homosexuality is no longer an issue, like even within the Republican Party. And so this is the pathway of the future. Right. The following year in 2011, Go Proud invites Donald Trump to be the speaker at CPAC that year. Wow. And this is the moment that sort of launches him as a serious in quotes, political candidate, right? A political figure, which sort of tees up his eventual presidential run. But as my book, takes, links to explain and to think about, it's so important to know that the organization that brought him into CPAC was this gay Republican organization, Go Proud.
So interesting. And it's so interesting, too, that despite the level to which gay conservatives have contributed to the success of this gathering and to the success of the party and Trumpism and so on, that there are so many bedwetters at CPAC. In 2015, Milo Yiannopoulos gets kicked out of CPAC because of a video that had actually been around for years, where he talks about having oral sex with a priest and, how good it was for him to learn how to do it. And this guy was so super friendly and nice. And so there's this sort of moral panic about pedophilia. So what do? They blame the victim and kick Milo out. Log Cabin Republicans is also kicked out that year, but then they're welcomed back in. Log Cabin Republicans, as we talked about before, seem to have lost most of its lesbian leadership, so it seems to be much more of a gay men's organization now. And now, to make this a little weirder, and I promise audiences, we are going to get back to Vance and Rubio, and there is a method for doing that. But we can't leave this conversation without talking about Matt Schlapp, who himself seems to be at least bisexual. He has repeatedly been accused of making advances to men. In 2022, a staffer for Georgia Senate candidate Herschel Walker accused Schlapp of sexually assaulting him in a car. The accuser settled for a sum of money in 2024. And then in 2025, he apparently, they call it groping, but apparently he just like grabbed this guy's junk and stared at him in the eyes. And the man's girlfriend came up and said, "What do you think you're doing?" So he's got a little problem. I think he's probably got a drinking problem, if you ask me. But so we've got Schlapp, but this has not actually caused anyone to say he shouldn't be running what is essentially a youth organization. How do we understand that, Neil?
Yeah, I don't know, because I mean, this is like, if you historically you look at this organization and other conservative organizations, the littlest hint that someone had not a sexual indiscretion, but any sort of homosexual, like they were tinged with any sort of like a rumor about they were out,
Right.
And so this guy has been able to stay in this position. I think in a lot of ways, this is something we talk about a lot, is just the new context that Trump has provided that allows for all sorts of these folks to get away with anything because of the guy, in the White House and everything that's been allowed for him. So I think that's partly it. You always wonder if he knows where some bodies are buried that like helps him maintain his power too.
Right.
There is part of me that wonders if this is a little bit of a sign that CPAC actually doesn't matter that much. That no one's taking the opportunity to like oust Schlapp, but I think that's probably not it.
I think it probably isn't it either, but it did cause me to wonder whether part of what is going on with how aggressive Turning Point USA is becoming is not just capitalizing on Charlie Kirk's tragic assassination, but that they're really making a bid to be the leadership youth organization in the country. But, this is my pivot to get back to Vance and Rubio, which is there is a certain homoerotic current running through MAGA, period. It's not just CPAC. It's not just the grinder crashes. It's Donald Trump talking about how handsome and good looking his cabinet members are, about how, he might just kiss them. And in particular, the choice of Vance as Trump's running mate was explicitly, yes, because he had working class origins and came from Ohio, but also because he was young. And the right-wing media tried to sell him as this sort of sexy, handsome second coming of John F. Kennedy, but of a movement not made up of women, but made up of young men. That hasn't worked, though, has it, when people actually found out who Vance was?
Yeah, I mean, like the more people know about Vance, or maybe the more time they spend with him, like they don't seem to like him as much, right? And so he's someone who, and I think this is like a real, like, not failure, a weakness on his part is he's not a good politician because his likability, I think, is something that just, although he does have high favorabilities, but I think favorability and likability are not the same. But I mean, I think, do you think that's a large part of it, Claire? Is that like he just has not really positioned himself well in his own public appearances, and there's something like a little bit oily about him that I think like people, even the base, feels when they spend more time with him.
I think he seems like a little bit of an empty suit because he's so changeable. He has shifted back and forth. He was anti-Trump and now he's pro-Trump. Now that would make him like a lot of other people. Yeah. But his MAGAification doesn't seem very authentic. It's very vicious. It's very cruel. He seems to relish the role as Trump's attack dog, even when what he's saying makes him look like a mean and horrible person. Now, Yes, you mentioned that Vance has a high favorability. That's only among Republican voters.
Yeah.
And people who are registered Republican are only a third of the electorate. And what I think is interesting is he has a 75% favorability with those voters. RFK Jr. has a 74% favorability.
That is wild.
Rubio has a 64% favorability. Trump is still in the 80s somewhere. So even if Trump is dragging everybody down, Trump still has a higher favorability rating than his vice president. I mean, in a way, that kind of makes sense. But the window for announcing a presidential campaign is about 2 years. And I don't think either Vance or Rubio seem to really be standing out as great candidates. What do you think?
Yeah, not at all. I feel like, obviously as a VP, you got a lot of advantages there.
Right.
It's hard to mess it up. It feels like Vance is somebody who really could, because who is he? Like, who is he as a person? Even which version of like MAGA does he want to be? And how does he calculate that post the midterms, which may be an enormous rebuke of the Republican Party. So how does he sort of walk that line? I think it's a bit of a challenge in a way that, again, usually if you're a VP of a two-term president, usually, I mean, not, and it's an unusual circumstance here, you're sitting fairly pretty. I think Marco Rubio has some real opportunities to take advantage of here to sort of present himself as MAGA, but reasonable MAGA. It seems to me that that's been the role he's tried to play in the administration, sort of distancing himself from Trump at certain points. And, so he just seems like a shrewder politician as well. I mean, you just use the word inauthentic, and that to me is like the word that just comes up over and over again for me when we think about Vance. He's just so sort of soulless and so accommodating to whatever it seems like will grant him power. And I just think that becomes really obvious to voters.
Well, and, I hate to make it oral exams time again, Neil, but how many vice presidents have actually been elected to the presidency in the last century? I think there are more vice presidents who became president when the president that they ran with died. I mean, think Theodore Roosevelt, think Harry S. Truman, think Calvin Coolidge, think, I don't know, is there another president who died? Oh, I wish this one would. But who has gotten elected without, Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, I was going to say JFK.
Right? So who in the 20th century has been elected from the vice presidency? George Herbert Walker Bush and... Right.
Yeah. I mean, in the 21st century, we have Biden.
Okay. But he had to skip a cycle.
He did, yeah.
In order to be elected. And Biden ran like 4 different times. I mean, at a certain point, it was like, okay, guy. And of course, the situation we were in was getting rid of Trump. So I think almost any Democrat could have gotten us all mobilized, not to be cruel about Joe Biden, who I'm very fond of. But in other words, history is not in J.D. Vance's favor. And partly it's that in this highly mediated age, yes, the vice president becomes a known person, but not like the president does. And of course, Trump has been sending him around to do all these sort of ceremonial things around the world while Marco Rubio is doing real work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like it would be interesting if we ever see it, which we very well may, to see the two of them on a debate stage, and how they use their Trump roles to distinguish each other. You can almost imagine Marco Rubio just being like, what is your record? Like, what did you do? You went to the Olympics, you sat on Twitter and like, acted like a 24-year-old social media influencer, but like, what's your record? And Marco can point to quite a record now. I mean, one that I have a lot of problems with, and a lot of Americans do as well. Right. But like, there's a policy record and I think a leadership record there that like Vance just cannot produce.
Right. And, you know, there are a couple things I think of when I think of Rubio running for president, which I think he would dearly love to be.
Yes.
One is Donald Trump saying, don't you think he'd make a great president of Cuba? I think that was Trump's idea of a joke, but it was actually sort of a weird and terrible joke. We have never had a Latino president or Marco Rubio to be elected. He would be a first. I think the second thing I wonder is whether this war in Iran is going to drag Rubio down. I mean, imagine Rubio on a debate stage with a Democrat saying, and you sent 10,000 Marines into the Straits of Hormuz and the ship that hit a mine and. And I wonder to what extent the incoherence and unpopularity of this war on Iran is going to, shall we say, torpedo any chances that Rubio has to be elected, because independents will not want to have anything to do with him and Republicans won't be inspired by him.
Yeah. It's hard to really see who emerges from this party, given where things are right now. Obviously, someone will. I'm a little bit freaking out about these numbers about RFK Jr. 74%. I mean,
yeah.
So anything can happen, I guess.
Anything could happen. All right, Neil. Well, we will keep our eyes on the Princes of Darkness, and let's turn to what we want to go viral this week. What do you want to go viral this week?
What I want to go viral is this really fascinating and quite disturbing piece that came out in the Fulcrum a few days ago called The Quiet Rise of Employee Surveillance. It's by Faith Wilson. Full disclosure, Faith Wilson is one of my fellows in a op-ed project fellowship I'm leading right now called Technology in the Public Interest. She's an expert on the law and technology, especially around digital privacy. And this piece is an absolutely fascinating and chilling account of something I didn't know at all about, which is so many employees now are collecting biometric data from their employees, and there's not a thing you can do about it, pretty much. And so this piece gets into that, and how, in a lot of ways, this is all about the fact that there is no federal employment law that gives people the option to consent to biometric collection. And so employers can use, or rather they can require their employees to undergo scanning systems and other biometric applications, and apparently a lot of them are doing it. And their justifications for doing so are things like, this is tied to security and to fraud and to crime prevention, but it's tracking of employees that I think, most of us are not comfortable with at all. In fact, when it comes to biometric data, that's one of the things that people rank highest as wanting to have complete privacy around. And so there's, there's just sort of a really fascinating exploration of the conditions that have allowed for this to become an aspect of the modern workplace, and the fact that only a handful of states have any privacy laws that cover biometric data, and so the piece really calls for intervention at the federal level, which probably is not going to happen in this administration or anytime soon. But it's well worth reading, I think, for all of us to be informed, especially those of us who work in big corporate settings, about what very well may be taking place when you hand over information and all sorts of other things to your employees. So we'll link to this piece. Again, it's called The Quiet Rise of Employee Surveillance.
Wow. It's a great piece. And, it made me wonder things like, what happens to the fingerprint that I use to open my phone and my computer, particularly if my computer is given to me by my employer? But it also made me think, Neil, that the period in which digital technology has more or less taken over the workplace is also a period in which Congress became so incredibly partisan that Republicans and Democrats stopped working together on anything, and that the law is so far behind on regulating the digital world and digital practices and digital workspaces and so on, in part because Congress really hasn't had any kind of a real focus other than stopping the other party from doing any work.
Yeah.
And mostly I blame Republicans for this, but I'm willing to listen to the argument that the Democrats are at fault too. But really, it's the political class that has failed to serve us. And this is why we're ending up in a terrible situation with children and digital technology.
Yeah.
Okay, Neil, I want everyone to take a deep dive into a new report by Sophie Culpepper at Harvard University's Nieman Lab. It's called How a Minnesota Mom and Minister Blew Past Her Screen Time Limits When ICE Came to Her City. And so Culpepper asked what I think is sort of an obvious question, but I don't think anyone's asking it. If only 16% of Americans pay for news, how do they get it? Okay, the obvious answer is social media, which often includes content distributed by major news organizations. That's the good news. But really, Culpepper found that most people were getting their news through WhatsApp and Signal and group chats of various kinds. And visual evidence from non-news sources generally arrives first, with users then going to news sources to confirm or amplify raw footage or images taken on the scene. So we have this weird situation in which news is coming to people without context, without any verification, and they are spreading it on all these private channels. And, I've always thought of X and Facebook and so on as the major locations. That's simply no longer true.
Me too.
What Culpepper says is that social media is a way to get stories into a national conversation, but that we have to start tracking people's social networks in real life as well. So that, for example, she points to mom chats that are usually established to coordinate, school pickups, school events, and so on. They're particularly prominent in this story as purveyors of news and as fundraising vehicles for causes. So I think what Culpepper is saying is basically a lot of what used to happen when you were waiting for your kid after school at the playground is now happening digitally, but that it's this sort of weird mix of fake news, real news, and raw footage that people don't really know what to do with, and then they go and research on their own.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating article about how people get news today, how they consume it today, and how they think about it.
Interesting. Sounds really fascinating. And I did not know that WhatsApp and like, what's the other one that you mentioned? That's where people are.
Signal.
Yeah. I mean, I just thought again it was like Facebook and but that's really fascinating in terms of how the distribution is happening.
Yeah, I don't think anything's happening on Facebook anymore.
No, probably not.
If I really cared, I would investigate it, but I hate Facebook so much now, and the only reason I stay on it is to publicize this podcast. So, Neil, with that, I think we're at the end of the news for this week, and I'll see you next week.
I'll see you next week. Have a good one.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads at Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Shrug It Off by Divisioner. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.